Instead of reading his whole biography, which you have in your folder, I'd just like to say that what he's going to talk about, Why Only Us, The Origins of Human Language, is the subject of what I regard as a groundbreaking book that he wrote with Noam Chomsky about a year and a half ago.
He only gets 5% of the
I don't think I'm being hyperbolic in saying that of science books, among science books written in the last few decades, this is probably one that has one of the top as far as its potential philosophical and theological implications. And I think everybody here should go out and get a copy.
That's right. So we're auctioning off this one.
And don't just take it out of the library. You have to buy it. Okay? But anyway, so we're very honored to have Bob Berwick address us today.
Thanks very much, Stephen. I wanted to thank Stephen in particular for this very kind honor and invitation, and also to the Society of Catholic Scientists and to their very generous funders for this opportunity. And so yes, I'd like to begin by saying what I want to talk about, and it's no less than trying to account for the origin and the evolution of human language, something that almost all observers, no matter what their theological or non-theological bent, would say it's actually part and parcel of what makes us special as human beings. It's part of our creative imagination. It's what Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of evolution by natural selection, said was central to human moral nature. Okay, so that's a very interesting thing, because I think, as you'll see, as we look around the animal kingdom, you can find it in just us. Hence the title. So that's what I would like to talk about today, and we'll see how far we can get through that. And I'm going to actually do this in the form of trying to pose it as answers to a mystery story. So in any of these BBC mystery stories or some detective story, there's always these questions you want to answer. You know, what is language, right? Who has language? When did language develop? Where did it develop? How did it develop? Why did it develop? And then we'll see if we can hit all those questions that are gone over in much more detail in the book. Now, so why is this, some kind of mystery at all? And that itself is interesting. It's a mystery because this guy on the left, Wallace, whom I've mentioned, and Charles Darwin both discovered the theory of evolution by natural selection at the same time. Their joint work was published in the Linnaean Society in June of 1858, as I recall, June 9th. A year later, Darwin publishes Origin of Species. Wallace doesn't actually publish a book on this topic. But then about 7 years after that, Wallace writes a letter to Darwin. And he says in this letter, I've been thinking about adaptation, because Wallace was a very strict adaptationist. He thought unless a trait had some kind of function that would really help an organism in its reproductive success, so it was in that sense more fit, they didn't use that term, okay? Unless it could do that, it shouldn't really be around. And so in this letter he said, I've been thinking about this, and if you think about something like language or art or music, then really we should have been endowed with brains no larger than the size of a small ape, because we would get by just the same. Because they can get by with all that. So what's all that extra stuff for? What is it? He said, we seem to have more than nature needs. Why? Right? And so what he did in this letter, he said, this is something that doesn't fall under natural selection, and he just told Darwin this straight out in this letter. And Darwin, in true BBC style, was aghast. He said, you have murdered my unborn child. That's what he said. And Darwin never withdrew from that position. Okay, so there's the actual Journal of the Linnaean Society. And so because of this, we now, to this day, have called this Wallace's problem. It's the problem of why does something like language exist? Why music? Why art? And we'll see we can tie all those things together in the origin of language. And so that's why I say that's a pretty ambitious goal, but we'll see how far we can get. And as I said, there's lots of consensus on this topic. So not only if you turn to Genesis, and Adam gets to name all the animals, the creative act, but it goes back even a little bit further. So you do a little bit of history research, and you get to the Babylonian Talmud. This is the Manhik-Sahedrin. This written, published version is from 500 AD, but it probably goes back to 100 BC. And as you can see here, it's Aramaic on the top and the English translation on the bottom. And as you can see here, even by this point in time, what these people had come up with is what we would nowadays call the Turing test. Because it says, Rava created a person, a golem, sent it before another rabbi. The other rabbi spoke to it, but the golem would not reply. It did not have language. And so the rabbi says, you're a creation of one of the magicians, return unto the dust. So that was the Turing test. That's the litmus test that they had in 100 BC. And as far as I can tell, it's no better or no worse than the Turing test. So much for that. So nobody does history and computer science, and they've just forgotten about all this stuff. But okay, so that was part of that zeitgeist. But even if you turn to the most utterly rational of the modern Enlightenment rationals, this is the cover of the Puy-Royal Grammar from the 1700s, the first systematic attempt to build what would now be called a universal grammar. When you turn to that, it also points out, it's about page 43 or so, that in this somewhat stilted old French, that language is the center of our spiritual natures, and the core of that has to do with the fact that we can combine over and over and over again, as you can, now I don't know if I can have a pointer, but as you can see in the last lines, it says we have 26 or 27 symbols that we can use. We can combine them in endless ways to form whatever kinds of writing we might want to form. Okay, so that's the stage. So how do you answer all those questions? So the tack that Chomsky and I took is the usual sort of tack, which is, well, we can't solve all these problems, but the number one problem to solve is actually to get some kind of working, not quite a definition, but at least an account of what you might call the language trait, the basic language trait, what that is. Because if you don't do that, then the biologists will just, wave goodbye. Because, for example, if you can't define what an eye is and understand what the eye is supposed to do, you're not going to be able to understand its evolutionary history or really say anything precise about it at all. So here was so that's our approach, which is, what's the basic language trait? And so what we did was we said, okay, we can divide what language consists of into three parts. Okay, one part is going to be a kind of operator that I'll just call glue, that takes words together, like ate and ice cream, and puts them together to get something like ate ice cream. It glues smaller pieces into larger pieces. So it's just a kind of algebraic machinery. Okay, so you need that, and you need, of course, the dictionary of these word-like elements. That's one part. The second part of language is that there's the part that connects that interior computation that goes on inside your brain to the outside world. And that we'll call the sensory or motor input-output system. So just like your computer has a CPU, and you have to have some input-output system like an inkjet printer or a laser printer, but you got to have something to actually get those results into the outside world. Language has to have that too, if it's the case you want to get those things to the outside world. Notice we're not saying that's necessarily true. In fact, what we'll wind up saying is that most of the time, for all we know, and in fact, if you have a spouse, they'll, of course, tell you this is actually the truth, which is that you do a lot of talking inside your head and sometimes can't stop yourself from from it spilling out at night, but a lot of it goes on inside, and it never comes out. But that's okay. So there's that second piece, sensory motor input-output system. So notice I say they're both speech, but also sign, because as you know, we now know that gestures in terms of sign language is just the same as any other natural human language. Okay? And in fact, there's even some forms that are done by touch. So what's called haptic input-output. Okay? So you can switch the printer from inkjet to laser to haptic to the modality does not seem to matter. Okay, so that's why we box that off in a separate component. So there's some kind of externalization process that takes whatever you've constructed inside your head in terms of language and then projects it out onto the outside world. Okay? Finally, there's a third component. So just these three now. And the third component is an internal interface. And so what's done here is the constructions of your language, something like, say, John ate ice cream, however that's constructed into some kind of mental representation, that interfaces to the rest of your conceptual reasoning system, systems of inference, planning, whatever you want to say there. And so the way we're going to attack the evolution problem is this way. We're going to claim that most of that input-output apparatus was antecedently evolved. We can find it everywhere from birds to other organisms. Okay, so that system's in place. And then it's been co-opted for use, as often happens in evolution, in the language case. So that's why I put the little checkbox there. So we're not going to solve that problem, but I'll show you how it's different from what human language is. And that's often a place where people stumble and get confused because they equate speech with language. But speech is just the input-output system. You wouldn't say your CPU had been totally destroyed if your laser printer broke. If you do that, you're getting charged big bills you shouldn't get charged for. So don't do that. Okay? Similarly, what about that internalization interface? Well, that turns out to be a lot trickier. And in fact, we're going to do a little bit of a finesse here, one that actually Steve mentioned in a review of our book, and I'll come back to that. That's a little more subtle, mostly because it's hard to understand what the internal representations of inference systems and concepts are. But as I said, I'll come back to that. So that leaves the one thing we are going to try to attack and look at in evolutionary terms, and that's that blue circle at the top, the compositional operator. We believe that's the single component that had to be put in place to link up all the others, and when that appeared, you had the emergence of fully human language. So that's our focus, just that one trait. Now why do we want to do that? And that's because language seems to have, as we'll see with pretty concrete evidence, seems to have emerged relatively rapidly, just about 50, 60,000 years worth of evolutionary time, not much time for any genomic change. It's genomically uniform in the human species. It doesn't appear anywhere else in any other species we know of. And the evolutionary people have a great word for this. They call it an autapomorphy. That just means it's unique. Okay? And it didn't take that, as I said, didn't take that much time. So that means it can't have been that much of a change. But yet, by plugging in the keystone of this arch, you get the whole arch formed. Okay. So then you say, well, gee, so what is the basic language trait then? What's that blue circle look like? So I'll do it sort of schematically. You can do this all in a very beautiful algebraic and mathematical way. You can build machines for it, but this is not the time and place for that. So let me just show you with pictures. So as I said, the way to think about it is I can take some kind of quasi-conceptual item like 8, that's blue, apples, that red circle, and the plus just means to combine them. Okay, and I take them together, and what I do is I form you'll see I form a triangle. So what am I doing? Why triangle? So what I'm going to claim is that what this operator does is take 8 apples and forms a little miniature triangle that itself can be considered a single object. So 8 apples is now one chunk. So I drew down the chunk as a triangle. And I'll call that property merge, because it takes 2 elements, merges them together, and creates a larger one. Now that merge operation can operate recursively. That is, it can apply to its own output. So I can take 8 apples, and I can now apply that, so that's the triangle on the right. I can apply that to gnome, and I get a new larger triangle, gnome 8 apples. And now you can begin to see this, this looks like these pictures they taught me in grammar school or something. Okay, so this is the syntactic structure of human sentences, of human language. And it requires, apparently, just this single operation. And it will turn out to be different from what we see in all the other animals that you study. It has builds these triangles inside your head. And I can actually illustrate this with an example. So when I have gnome 8 apples, so that was like a set of stacked triangles. Now you can actually, as I said, now demonstrate that's actually true. So here's a pretty fun example to look at. So here I've just put down a set of words in order, linear order. So eagles that fly instinctively swim. Okay? It's just one, as you would hear it in speech. Boom, 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 boom. So now I can ask you. See, this is like, it's going to be like a class. So you're not going to get out of here without doing an exam. You're not going to, so on, so on, so on. Eagles that fly instinctively swim. What does that mean? Well, one thing it could mean is that it's the case that eagles fly, and what they do is that they instinctively swim. So the adverb instinctively modifies swim. That's right. That's one thing. But that's not the only thing it could mean. There's many other things. Anybody have what's the other possibility? Yeah. Yeah, you could say that the flying is instinctive. You could say eagles that they fly instinctively. And then what they also do is swim, right? So at least those 2. Maybe more, but that's fine. That's all I need. Now, so here comes the interesting part. I'm going to manipulate just one word in that sentence and put instinctively at the front of the sentence. So you see the difference? So now, instinctively, eagles that fly swim. So that was the original. Eagles that fly instinctively swim. I put instinctively at the front. Instinctively, eagles that fly swim. Now what? What does it mean now? What's the instinctively modify? Swim. Only swim. But why? Fly is closer. Fly is closer in linear terms. So if your brain operated the way speech works, left to right and linearly, the prediction would be that instinctively should modify swim, but it doesn't. It doesn't. Rather, instinctively modifies swim. Why? Well, if you think about it in terms of the triangles, it becomes obvious. If you draw it out in terms of the triangles, I have eagles that fly here and instinctively swim, so it's eagles doing the swimming. So instinctively is closer to swim. When it's in terms of what triangle is above what other triangle. That's the key difference. I want to emphasize that. So inside your brain, rather than having a linear representation of the speech signal that came in, what your brain does is rearrange it into this hierarchical stack structure that looks like that one underneath, instinctively swim. To put it another way, and this is a totally surprising finding, because people, okay, while the order of the words that come into your ears have a left to right sequence because of temporality. I don't mean left to right, literally. Right? So they're temporally ordered like that. Right? So they're ordered. The structures inside your brain that you construct for the sentences don't have that left to right order. Your brain throws that away. Literally throws that away. And human syntax does not make use of left to right order. This was a total surprise when linguistic science started, when Chomsky started doing this kind of work around about 1950 or so, because people had looked at this for thousands of years and had never noticed this. Not once. You can go back and look through all the grammarians, and they never noticed this effect. Okay? And so the way to summarize this point is to say what your brain does, this little CPU that has the job of building human syntax, it builds triangles inside your brain. That's all it does, constantly. It takes the word sequences coming in, it takes the gestures that are coming in, if you're doing signing, and it constructs these hierarchical triangles out of them. So what reaches the ear is ordered, what reaches the mind is unordered. Okay? So it's the basic property is the one that constructs these little triangles. All right? So now, as I said, so now we're going to get to an account of some of the evolutionary properties, because we narrowed down, what this actually had to be. Okay? And once you have a basic property like this operation merge, this one that builds triangles, I won't use this pseudo-technical term merge. Once you have that, you can build arbitrarily complicated sentences. We were talking at lunch about David Foster Wallace sentences, but there are lots of other kinds. All right? And back in the 18th century, it was noticed, in fact, that this is what allows us to make infinite use of just a finite rule system along with words. It was called infinite use of finite means. And from this we can construct sentences that have whatever complexity one wants. And I say infinite misuse because, of course, the way you actually build those sentences and put them to use might be great or not so great. So here's my favorite not so great. Almost inconceivably, the gun into which she was now staring was clutched in the pale hand of an enormous albino with long white hair. C-, right. And of course, this is from the Da Vinci Code. So that'll tell you something. Well, exactly. Maybe by some computer. But it's so much better than the book we did. But so you can construct these enormously elaborate sentences, and you have this very basic operator, this very basic computational system that can do it. Okay? So that's pretty nifty. Now, so it turns out we're the only animals that seem to have that. So just to summarize that again, and this will show up in lots of different areas of things that we do, but just to make to give you a simple idea of another area where this shows up, where we think, in fact, it's bled over from language before moving on to the other animals. I'll show you, another example of quote merge or building triangles in the way that human beings build tools. So while it's the case that there are lots of other animals that build tools and use tools, there's no animal that builds a tool that looks like this. I'll show you in a second. That. Now what is that? A pencil. Sure. But if you think about a pencil, what is it? It's a combinatorial tool. On the one end is the part you write with, and on the other end is the part you erase with. That's the one I use more often than the one I write with. But it's been put together into a single new object, just the way John ate apples has been put together. No other animal does that in any way. Okay? No other animal. Instead, what I'll show you, what it seems to be that animals are actually stuck with Because I mentioned to you what it looks like is that what animals are stuck with is that basic first component that has to do with the input-output system, which is all, remember, just linear. It has to do with linear order of words, linear order of things, linear orders of associations. So let me again show you with some fun examples. So the input-output system, you can illustrate this way. So this is actually two spectrograms on the left and the right of newborn babies. They're about an hour old, and recordings were made of their cries. I think, if you're parents, you know about babies crying, as you'll see. Okay? So I'm going to now play these. So don't be alarmed. You don't have to. Okay. So one of those is a German baby. And one of them is a French baby. So your first exam question is you have to figure out which is which. So I'll play it again so you can. Votes? Which is the French? No, let's do votes. Who says the first one is French? German. The first one is German. Okay. The second one is French. You can change your vote.
This is Chicago.
Yeah, I understand about that. That was the best. See, he didn't get this 5% for no reason. Right? The first one is a typical French cry. And the second one is a German. The first one is rising intonation, papa, and the second one is falling, papa. And where the babies pick this up is they can detect the low frequency sounds even when it's filtered through the uterus of the mother. Then they can hear that in the womb. There's lots of other stuff they really can't hear. So, for example, the Mozart, no, forget it. We've done those experiments. I mean, Mozart put through this filter does not sound like Mozart. But so you see, so babies when they're born have already started learning the sound system of their mother's language, their mother's native language, but not the syntax. And of course, they don't know that they really don't have the words yet either. So about the first year or so, they're actually pinning down all those sounds. All right? And the crucial part is that sound system that we know of in humans and in all other animals is linear. It's one thing after another. Boom, 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 boom. And I'll illustrate that with the next slide, where I'll show both an example of a vocal learning non-human animal, in this case a zebra finch, because as you know, there are some birds that learn the songs of their adult male tutors in order to attract mates or territory or whatever. And so they have very particular patterns of songs in the same way that you saw this particular intonational pattern. And the same thing is true of more complex sound systems in human languages. But the important point is those look more or less the same when you analyze them mathematically. They look like this. They're linear, but again, they're not triangles. They're not hierarchical. They don't use merge. They don't work that way. So our evolutionary story is that they were there antecedently. So this is a Bengalese finch, and if you write it down as one of these little, flow diagrams, you can see it's just sort of a linear one with maybe some loops in it. And this is a case of Navajo. Well, I guess the sound didn't come out. Oh well. But the sounds just move along left to right, and that's the point. Not only is that true, but a couple years ago, a student, a postdoc at MIT, did a very careful genomic study and neural study. He actually had started this at Duke. And what he was able to do is to show that when you look at humans and songbirds, I guess I'm going to have to point this out on the screen. You can actually see that the neural system is actually wired up the same way and uses the same genomic toolkit of about 100 genes. It's been conserved. So this is an example of convergent evolution in these two species that are both vocal learners. So on the top, those are both vocal learning species. So a songbird and a human. And you see this red line? That red line goes in the human from the larynx up to the motor cortex, so you can control your speech. I know there's some politicians that can't control their speech, but and the same in the songbird. It's this red line here that goes to the analogous area, which is labeled RA. Chickens and monkeys are not vocal learners. If you ever hear, that's why chickens don't have lips. You know, you finally have that answer. But it's true. Yeah, if you ever hear a chicken talk, then please bring it back to MIT and we'll. Okay, so there are those neurological differences. Okay, and there are actually genomic differences that have been entirely conserved. So it's as if that toolkit was ready to be plopped into place. So not all primates, as you just saw, do vocal learning. But the toolkit is sitting around waiting to be cranked up. And it's linear. It works in this linear way. All right, so that's one part. The second part of what animals can do and can't do has to do a little bit with concepts and reasoning. Because animals are actually pretty smart. So I think not a day or week goes by when they have some story about, that animals can do certain things that we always thought people couldn't do this, but now it looks like they can, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So who does language, or who does, if it's not language, can do smart things about making tools? This is a western scrub jay. It's lowering a rock into a little anthill, and it's tied a little knot around a stone so it can have the ants grab onto the stone and it can eat the ants. Okay. The bottom below there is a Japanese carrion crow, which I'll demonstrate for you in a moment. Okay, in Tokyo. You can see the little crosshatch, and there's a chimpanzee. And as you may know, all the attempts to get chimpanzees, to try to train them to talk have failed. They, years ago, did this very careful study about trying to get them to learn American Sign Language. This was done at Columbia by Herb Terrace. Okay? But when you look at that, it becomes very apparent that the animals just had linear sequences of separate signs that they were imitating, throwing back, laundry lists, grocery lists of signs. And they have no syntax in this with these triangles at all. And if you don't believe that, you just have to start looking at what they actually, quote, said, although they're just throwing out signs. So this most famous chimp that was trained this way, I don't know if people saw this film that came out 4 or 5 years back, was called Nim Chimpsky. But here's what so Nim would gesture things like, give me you, or me want banana. And below I have the longest sign that Nim ever generated, which was apple me eat, give orange me give eat, orange me eat, orange give me eat orange. So what Nim was doing was he kept going until he got what he wanted. A very effective strategy if you're 2 or 3, as you know. Yeah? Right? But there's no human language there. There was just nothing. And you can actually show this in a very clever information theoretic way. One of my students, Charles Yang, did this in PNAS a couple years back, and it's a beautiful piece of work because it's totally objective. And you can see they had no syntax compared to 2-year-olds who were at roughly the same level of knowing the words or not. So the Japanese carrion crow is very clever about inferential reasoning, but again, has no syntax. So what is it doing there? So here with the help of my these are pistachios, but they're so small, it's hard to. So what the Japanese carrion crow does is if it finds these nuts, then it goes into the zebra walkway for the pedestrians. it waits until it sees that the walk light has changed. And then it rolls the nuts out and like that. Right? And then it scoots back. Then the light changes and the cars go bang, bang, bang. And then it waits until the walk light changes. It hustles back. It grabs the stuff that's now good to eat. Bang. That's smart. I don't think I could do it. But so it's an evolutionary thing. I mean, so you find this in Tokyo, but I think all the crows in either like Chicago or New York that tried this are now long dead. So that's evolution by natural selection for you. So they don't have this pencil trick. They don't have that trick. And they tried teaching chimpanzees how to recognize various visual symbols and try to put them in some kind of order. This is an example. I might scare you and tell you that this is actually the next menu system for Microsoft Word version 12. But I won't. But no, these are actual what they call lexicograms to try to get the animals to actually learn this stuff. But again, it just came out as things that were all just in a row. Okay, so the bottom line with the chimps and all the other animals, as far as we can tell, is something like this. So here's a picture of Laura Petito when she was a graduate student at Terrace's lab at Columbia, teaching NIM some signs. And as I said, they never got past this single array of signs, and that's why I have it described as just as a linear sequence. That's all they got. They could memorize a few of these very simple linear sequences, but that was it. So the world of the chimpanzee and all these other animals, it's very different from our world. So I want you to appreciate that. For the chimpanzee could, the way it understood, or as far as we could tell, what an apple or a knife, what was an apple? For a chimpanzee, for Nim, the apple was, it was somehow associated with the drawer that held the knife maybe, or the knife that cut the apple, or maybe it was Laura that gave me the apple. Just a list of associations. Pure Skinnerian behaviorism. That's right for those animals, but not for us. So for the animals, their world is external. All consists of external associations. They can't even begin to construct a sentence that says something like, the apple's next to the knife in the drawer. The simplest thing you could think of to say. They can't do that. That's not a thought for them. It's not even an extant thought. But for us it is, but it's inside our heads. You can think it, you don't have to say it. And of course we can think lots of things that aren't even there. If I said the apple's next to the unicorn in the drawer, even though the unicorns don't exist, nobody has a problem with that. So that just doesn't happen with other animals. All right, so we have this combinatorial operator that builds triangles. It operates on these word-like atomic elements, which I'll get to right next. And it looks like only we have that combinatorial operator and not the other animals. And that lets us dissociate ourselves from the external world and move to this other place that the 17th century rationalists called spiritual. And I think that's not a bad word for it, because it's not part of the physical world in some sense. Now, Noam and I don't understand what sense, because that's one of the things that we sort of, as I said, we danced around, because we didn't really have a good answer for it. We don't think anybody else has a really great answer either, and it has to do with this central problem, which is the word like atomic element. This. So this is not really all just original sin either. For the chimp, an apple is just this thing, this particular thing in the world right here. But that's not true for us. For us, I say, oh, here, think of an apple, fine, or here's an apple. If I change it, if I say, okay, here's an apple, nobody has any problem with that. Animals can try to emulate that a little bit, but they don't really do that. They don't do this abstraction that was mentioned. Maybe a little bit, but not really. And so this idea of where those word-like atomic elements come from, we left a mystery in our book, because we think there are no good theories of what sometimes is called concept acquisition. All the theories we know of just fall apart like a house of cards when you blow on them, even just a little bit. So I'll give you just two quick examples, and then move on to evolution, and then how that all got tied together. So so here's our red apple. But just to show you how hard that can be. Because again, unless you it's interesting. It's because everyone uses language all the time. So you think, oh, gee, it's like opening your eyes and seeing the world around you. I'm not conscious of doing any work. There's no computation that seems to be involved. So it's got to be easy. And so everybody not only thinks it's easy, they all have their own personal opinion on it. Because you introspect and you say, oh, yeah, I know what's going on. Well, not so clear. So still mysterious, the word-like atomic elements. So here's an example. Because then you want to think, well, how do kids ever do this? So I'll give you just two quick examples and then move on to some evolution. How do you ever do this? So here's a thing. So we'll start with an easy case, tiger. So do you really think the way you learned tiger is the way that David Hume said it worked? David Hume said, what I do is I point to the thing that's referred to and give it its name. Now, do you think that when the mother's there with the child and says tiger, that there's an actual tiger in the room? I hope not. See, so it's got to be a little bit more abstract than that. But this is the easy case. It goes sort of either downhill or uphill. If someone says, I see John in the park, are there eyes involved? If I say, student Johnson just realized something about the fundamental theorem of calculus. Is there a light bulb that goes on? All teachers wish this was true, but it's not true. So if I say, oh, I think I like ice cream, how do you represent a thought? Unknown. This is all terra incognita aside from just the very beginnings of work in this. And if you want to see, okay? So the word-like atomic elements we just passed on because we said we'll leave that for another book that sells much more, or something. All right. So what has to evolve at least is that input-output system, the word-like atomic elements for this triangle building operator to actually act on. And then finally, the keystone is this triangle operation system. It glues things together. So we're just going to look at the triangle operating system. And so the first question that arises there is when. So this is a very sketchy tree of the Homo lineage, starting down at the bottom at about 7 million years. It goes to the present day, 0 million years at the top. And the details don't matter. All you have to get out of it is the fact that it actually is a very branching tree. And there's more that are being added to this all the time. Now, thanks to genomics and thanks to lots of good paleoarchaeology, we can actually do a much better job of pinning down when and where this happened. So all this stuff goes on in Africa, as far as we can tell. The emergence of essentially the first Homo sapiens is about 200,000 years ago, antedated by what's called Homo erectus, which is that little skull you can see there. So I'll just give you a very quick branching picture of this so you have some rough idea of the timelines involved. And the point of this is to show you that as it happens, while there are branchings off that you saw on the previous slide, again, only us, which turn out to be Homo sapiens, wind up with this merge or triangle building operation. Okay, so you can see that, that again is in southern Africa. And then there's a long line that splits off and eventually goes over to Europe. And that becomes the Neanderthals. And they in turn split into two. Neanderthals, and you may have read about the Denisovans that eventually get over to Siberia. Okay? Now that's about 800,000 years ago. That's a fairly long time ago. So there's no language then. And I'll show you the proxy evidence why we know that's true. The anatomically modern humans split off 200,000 years ago. So you can see the skulls over here. And so they'll wind up right about here in this Ethiopia, not Ethiopia, but in that eastern Africa portion. Okay? Now the first clue we have that there's anything like symbolic activity, or which is our only proxy for the language activity, is about 90,000 years ago in Blombos Cave, marked by that red dot in South Africa. Okay, there are geometric markings, carvings on stone, very precisely made. You can see that stone is very small. That white marker line is a centimeter. Okay, and that's all we have. So there's nothing. So something could have been happening, between 90,000 years and 200,000 years ago. We just haven't found that yet. Okay, and then about 60,000 years ago, shown by that blue dot with the line going from Ethiopia over into the peninsula, that's the last exodus of modern humans out of Africa, about 60,000 years ago. And all this can be done with great precision using genomic methods now. So we know how the gene flow works. Okay, so that gives us a little bracketing about when this when this basic property, the triangle property, had to emerge. It's between 200,000 years to 250,000 years ago. Modern Homo sapiens, what are called anatomically modern humans, okay? And then all the way up to 80,000 years, we find the first Blombos Cave artifacts. Now I've added a little red dot you may see there in between. See the little red dot where it says 157,000 to 200,000 years ago, KYA, 1,000 years ago, are the Khoisan San Bushmen. Okay, so that's a currently living population whose initial origin has been traced back to that date, again by genomic methods. Okay, so by doing entire genome scans of these people, we can actually figure out that they have been isolated since that time. There have been intrusions, there's been gene flow back and forth 8,000, 4,000 years ago, but that's sort of irrelevant for this argument because it's way past that bracketing I have. Now, interestingly, they're the only, as far as we know, they're the only groups in the world that have what are called clicks in their language. So clicks are like chucking a horse, like that, except they have like 7 or 8 of them, and some versions much more. It's great for hunting prey because you can say it very, very, it transmits over a long distance and the prey just doesn't get it at all. So, and so when you look at that, you can actually see that they separated out at that time, and no other group did that. And see, that's very suggestive because it says that that basic property came into place, and it could be used for internal thought, for planning, inference, and so on. And then at some point it was externalized, but in different ways. And this looks like a little offshoot way that was never externalized in that way in any other group. So that's why I focus on this one. There's a lot more to be said about that, but I'll defer that. Now, as soon as that happened, then things took off. So you can see that there's enormous rapidity and change in all the Homo sapien descendants. That's exceptionally rapid. So I want to say one thing about that, and then a couple words on the Neanderthals. So I was wondering about my time, because I was wondering about my time here.
Maybe 5 more minutes.
Okay, good. So just to show you that how rapid this change was. Again, and we think this was fueled by this basic property of language that came in. On the left-hand side at the top, you see different species. Homo sapiens, that's us. Homo neanderthals, that's that other group. Homo heidelbergensis, that's on the left. The little horizontal bars is the amount of time that those species were extant. So if you look at Homo sapiens, along the x-axis, you have 2.5 million years ago all the way to the present time, 0 million years. The Homo sapiens start about, again, 250,000 years ago. So you see that just that little dark line right at the top. Should have brought my pointer. So right at the top up there. This part shows the different technologies that they have. Images, geometric engraving, so on, so on, so on. And the point to get out of this slide is that, notice the Neanderthals last almost from, we think almost about 1 million years ago, all the way to 20,000 years. They die out. But the point about them is there's no creativity. If you look at the kinds of tools they make, these mode 1, 2, or 3 tools, it's static. There's nothing of any real exciting creativity. And so what do I mean by static? It's pretty easy to show. So the Neanderthals, for 200,000 years, they make very, very beautiful tools. They're sometimes improved just a little bit, but they look like this. Whereas, of course, what humans do in just a mere few thousand years is they eventually wind up at 30,000 years before present doing something like this. Better than something you could find at the Chicago Art Museum. And we all recognize this. Whoever did this was just us. It's aesthetically pleasing and beautiful. The Neanderthals never did this, ever. They did not have that spark. So let's just show you how that ties together about what's going on and what happened with the language case. Okay, so I'll show just 4 more slides, and then we'll close it out. So this is a picture of the left side of the brain. Because remember, I said that the sound system developed first. And so we know a little bit about this. So if you look at that green and purplish area, that's the area we know where the information about words is stored. We don't know a lot of detail. You can see how gross that is. That area that's in orange is the area that has to do with the building triangles. Those arrows that connect it are actual white matter fiber tracks, big bundles of fiber that are covered with fat, myelin sheath, that tie those areas together. Okay? And so this is in an adult brain. And so if you want to drop labels on it, you get something that looks like this. That merge operation is in the orange. It pulls the words from the green area, and it ties them together, and it ships them off to other areas that figure out, oh, what does that mean? But I'll put, again, as I said, put that to one side. What's the point about that? Well, it's kind of interesting. If you look at those babies, remember the babies I showed? So even up to about 3 months, okay? So remember, there has to be that complete circuit that pulls the words together and then merges them. So these are fMRI pictures of the fiber tracks of the babies at 6 months. And you can see, as denoted by that blue arrow, you can see there's a gap. And there's a gap because the fiber track has not been fully myelinated. It's not insulated. It can't carry the current. So they can't do syntax. They haven't fully matured. In adults, it looks like this. And again, it's false colored with the blue, but you can see that's been filled in. So that goes all the way to age 13 or 14, where kids either mature or immature, depending on your point of view as a parent. But that's what happens. And not only that, when you look at other animals, so here's a macaque monkey with the same analysis. If you look, and so that little reddish area on the left is the area that would be merge. So if you look at the fiber tracks, you see that there's a gap. It's not wired up. So that's all the change that the kind of change you need to do, that slight rewiring of the brain. So not only did that give us this ability to do language, what's interesting is it gave us two other things. And then I'll close with that. One is, so why language and mathematics? So it turns out those are closely related, even though eventually in adults they wind up in slightly different areas. But again, if you think about it a little bit, remember, and you think about piano arithmetic, remember the successor function is just merging one more element onto what you had before. No other animal does it besides us. Okay, so we got that too. And not only do we get that, but we get something like this. So that comes from a succession of merge. But we also get music. So you do get Mozart. You just have to wait. You don't get the ability to write like Mozart, but at least you get to hear it. And so it's a very intriguing story about how evolution can happen rapidly in just us and give us what I think is, in fact, uniquely human. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.